Hello, my name is David. Welcome once again to the church Jesus built. Today we are discussing post-traumatic stress syndrome, a topic that touches absolutely everybody in one fashion or another. Jesus said, "The truth shall make you free." It is my hope and prayer that the revelations and the teachings that the Lord has taught me over the 40 years of counseling and behavioral science experience, that I would be able to in turn help so many others through this website and this video. You know, Satan has some pretty powerful ways of creating victims. He has ways of maintaining victims, and then from those victims creating a host of other victims. Once Satan gets this whole process rolling, it's like an avalanche rolling downhill that destroys almost all life in its path. This whole process of post-traumatic stress is very powerful, but there are many keys that unlock it. And we'll be teaching about that today. The sad reality is that everyone out there treating post-traumatic stress, almost everyone anyway, has no clue on how to really effectively treat it. In fact, for the most part, it seems to me that they actually end up making it worse. Reminds me of Abraham Lincoln, who, when shot in the head, they transported him across the street and laid him on a bed, started sticking their fingers and different tools in that hole in his head trying to get that bullet out. Actually killed him. There's a good chance that he might have survived with the bullet in his head, believe it or not. A lot of people have. At any rate, this also is not a subject that I've ever heard taught about in any church from any pulpit. This is an extremely important lesson that can set people free. As I said, I have 40 years experience in behavioral science. I have worked in every possible setting for behavioral science that you can imagine. And in most of those cases have been in the managerial position, either directing a clinic or assisted directing a clinic, to be sure. I taught for 3 years at the Academy of Health Sciences. I was responsible for several different aspects of behavioral science teaching, one of which was group dynamics. Through the years, I learned a great deal by God's anointing or revelation, and we want to share that today. It's interesting how I didn't really want to be in counseling at all, to be honest. In high school, I took all the hard sciences, all the hard maths. I even took Latin, believe it or not. But I needed an elective, so I took psychology, intro to psychology. I tolerated it for about 2 or 3 days and I quit. I thought, I can't handle that. That's ridiculous. It's a bunch of men's opinions. It's not science at all. And so I quit. Well, I was the last man drafted at the end of 1972. I decided that I would enlist so that I could have an option of not shooting at people and not being shot at. Seemed to be important to me at the time. So I actually tried to enlist in the Marines, Navy, and Air Force. And none of them would take me. Only the Army. And you know why? I'm colorblind. In fact, I think the test consisted of 26 colors. I think I got 3 of them right. Black, white, and gray, I think. Anyway, so I took the Army's test, and they said, "Oh, you did very well. You can do anything you want to do, except when you go line by line, everything that I wanted to do required the ability to see colors. Be surprised how many things that affects you." At any rate, right before bullet catcher and shooting at other people to take their life was counseling. So the Lord got me down that path into counseling. And through the years, I can humbly say that the Lord has allowed me to help thousands of lives through the programs that I have either worked in or certainly created. One of the things that I began to find in the several positions that I worked in the Army was an inordinate amount of the percentage of clients either in inpatient and outpatient mental health, inpatient and outpatient drug and alcohol, and even prison was a high percentage of men who had served in Vietnam suffering from post-traumatic stress. So I began to study and it was laid on my heart so much to help the Vietnam veteran. I had been so close. I had been in basic training when President Nixon pulled the plug, stopped sending people. So I was that close to going myself. In fact, at the time, I was sort of disappointed. I believed in the patriotism and so forth. And so I had a drill sergeant who came to me, Master Sergeant Bolin. I'm sure he's passed on by now, but being that it's more than 40 years ago. But he said to me, he said, son, I've been there a couple of times. That war is not what you think it is. Be glad, be grateful that you didn't go. So I began to assist the recovery of Vietnam veterans. And in the mid-'80s, I wrote a 12-step program, a self-help 12-step program for post-traumatic stress, and specifically the Vietnam veteran, to assist them in their recovery. We're still using the basic 12 steps that I created, say how many years ago, that 35 years ago, I don't know. How many ever it was a long time now. But at any rate, we're going to be using those basic steps to expand the horizon of post-traumatic stress. We're going to be addressing this topic from both a psychological and a spiritual realm. This is really where the rubber meets the road between the forces of good and evil. Okay. Evil, the devil, his intentions is to take everybody out of the game as quickly as they can. Obviously, if he can take them out before they're even born through this murderous process called abortion, then that's what he'll do. He'll take them out before they can even breathe their first breath. Otherwise, then he begins to work on a system to create victims, to create other victims, and so forth and so on. So this is a spiritual aspect as much as it's a psychological one. Post-traumatic stress originates in the subconscious mind. We have two parts of our brains, if you will, in the thinking process, the conscious part and the subconscious, okay? This is just sort of a diagram of how it looks via the power or the authority, if you will, of behaviors. Okay, the conscious mind operates the smallest portion of our behaviors, and the subconscious, I would say it's like a 10% versus 90%. I have often, in the classes that I taught, would say that, tongue-in-cheek, that the most important thing that the conscious mind is allowed to do from the subconscious mind is to decide, are you going to have peas or corn for supper? I mean, that's a pretty difficult task for the conscious mind, but it's about all the subconscious mind will trust the conscious mind with. What I'm really saying here is that most of your behaviors originate from the subconscious. You don't have to think about it. Oftentimes I would put a test to somebody. Let's say that you're standing on a street corner and some gang is, let's say, abusing someone, what would you do? And people will tell me, well, I just have to wait and see. No, the truth is that's not the truth at all. Your conscious mind is saying that. Your conscious mind is saying, well, I'll have to see what my subconscious wants me to do. Okay? I can tell you, I've been in circumstances where you have to react quicker than your conscious mind has the ability to react. I mean, instantaneously. What is on the inside of the subconscious, the rules by which you live, the setting for certain behaviors and certain standards is already in there, and you're going to react out of what's already in there. For example, it's sort of simple, you know, like when you learn how, your conscious mind has to physically learn how to tie your shoes, okay? But once you learn, you don't even think about it. You do it while you're thinking about something else. It's that same sort of concept by which you respond. So once behaviors are learned, or once the settings are set, then that's how you're going to operate out of certain whatever social circumstances you find yourself in. You're going to be reacting out of those primarily from the subconscious mind. We're basically an unconscious people. I'm sure that there are other cultures. I'm speaking primarily, obviously, from an American standpoint. I have lived overseas. I have been around a number of different cultures, but I haven't really actually studied them well enough to know that maybe whether or not, for example, one of the exceptions might be from my past in studying the Native Americans. I would venture to say that most of their decisions were probably made out of a conscious decision, although they probably were consciously aware of themselves and set their subconscious mind in a very strong way through their culture. But nevertheless, most of my research has actually been in the American culture. And we're unconscious people for the most part. In other words, you're the last one to know the truth about you, okay? Most of us can see somebody who is inappropriate, you know, not very nice to be around. I could use certain terms, but not. Anyway, but that person who's acting inappropriately or, not very nice, likely has no idea in their conscious mind that they're acting that way, or have any real concept of why they're doing it, even if they do have some idea that they're acting that way. All right, so we've got a lot to discover here, a lot to teach. Hopefully this will be clear as mud, or cleared up rather than as mud now as we go. Okay. One of the reasons, or one of the biggest reasons, actually, that the conscious mind exists, by the glory of God, is there's a trillion different bits of information coming into the conscious mind, passing through the conscious mind on a regular basis. The conscious mind doesn't have the ability to sort through all of that information and figure out what's important, how to prioritize it, how to respond to all of the stimuli, and so forth and so on. So the conscious mind is sort of, in this case, it's sort of like the monitor. And this is an excellent example of how the relationship between the conscious and the subconscious mind, in that the conscious mind is the monitor, and the subconscious mind is the hard drive. Everybody now is computer geeks, so I didn't grow up that way myself. I had to learn computers kicking and screaming. But anyway, whatever's showing on the monitor has been predetermined, or whatever you're working on, for example, whatever program it's up and running, is all the information is stored, and all the rules for operating these programs on a monitor is hidden, stored in the hard drive. None of the real thinking goes on in the monitor. Okay, almost all of the information, the rules for how to work those programs is all right there in the hard drive. So there's basically a one-way information system. The information passes, as I said, through the conscious mind and into the subconscious mind, and whatever, then the subconscious mind basically screens all of that information, and whatever it trusts the conscious mind with, it will send back out. Most of that information is not completely true. It's been cleaned up and purified. Spots are missing, things are changed, and that sort of thing. So that, of course, all depends again on how conscious you choose to be in your life and take charge, and that's what we'll be talking about. But there's this layer called plausible deniability. Why is it? And for some people, this little barrier, if you will, the Great Wall of China here, is thicker for some people than others, because you actually see some people who can tell lies, tell stories, these fantastic stories. You ever been around somebody tell some great stories, right? I jumped out of a spaceship and whatever, and it's crazy stories. Anyway, but they tell them as if they're real, and some to them it is real, okay? Because their subconscious mind has created a need for these stories in their lives, and it sends it over to the conscious mind and as truth, and somehow they're able to believe it and tell it like it's really real. I'm reminded of plausible deniability first came up with Ronald Reagan, the President Ronald Reagan, when, what was it? I forget what it was, arms to the Contra or whatever it was. Anyway, so he had a cushion between him and what was really going on, and so when they asked him about it, he didn't know anything, supposedly, and I'm sure he didn't. But anyway, so people can ask us what's really going on, and so we check. What we check is not the hard drive. What we check is the files that are stored in the conscious mind, and according to those files, because those are just temporary files based on what the subconscious mind is put in there, so it seems true. So we don't know anything. We didn't do it. I didn't do it. It wasn't me, So anyway, so we're going to talk about the power. So when God creates something, it's healthy. But Satan, he doesn't create nothing. What he does is destroy stuff, manipulate stuff, causes to work not correctly or malfunction or whatever. But so Satan has taken what God has created and worked against us. So it's sort of like, what is it? They said, I have met the enemy and the enemy is us. And that's true. We're our worst enemies for the most part. We are what's keeping ourselves from accomplishing our goals most of the time, to having a normal life maybe, or to have a satisfactory life or whatever. That's what is malfunctioned in here is what is driving our train and causing us to not be able to achieve our goals, to find peace, and maybe even keeping us from God because of that whole victimization. We'll talk about that in a little while. So let's talk about how the post-traumatic stress sort of thing gets kicked in. Okay, so if we have, this is an example, of course, we have a thermostat. And that thermostat has a little brain in it, and it is responsible for heating the home so that all the occupants don't freeze to death. Well, on the coldest night of the year, electricity goes out and the people nearly freeze to death. Electricity comes on a couple of days. The thermostat with the little brain says, oh my goodness, I failed. I was not prepared for that. We're going to make sure that we're never caught with our pants down again. And so here's what happens. The thermostat says that can happen at any time. I'm going to be prepared. I'm never going to be caught unexpected again. Because you know that's what trauma is. A situation that we're not prepared for. Okay? That's the reason why we're having so many soldiers come back from these engagements with post-traumatic stress. They've never really been taught how to prepare for the horrors of war. Not sure that would be easy, but the point is that trauma is a situation or an event, usually horrific in nature, that we're not prepared for. So anyway, the thermostat says from now on, we're going to set the thermostat at 85 degrees. I don't care if it's 80 degrees out. My thermostat is going to be 85 degrees. We are always going to be prepared because thermostat figures that if the heat goes out, electricity goes out at 85 degrees, it'll take a while for the house to cool down where they would have people have to worry about freezing to death. Right? You got a cushion of insurance, if you will. Safety cushion there. So what has to happen is, in psychological terms, that's sort of the same thing. People stay psychologically on alert at the same level as the trauma, or maybe even higher, as described here, because they want to make sure that they're alert and ready for any possible, the worst possible situation. So in these particular cases, what has to happen is the subconscious has to be reprogrammed. It has to be taught and controlled and reprogrammed through the conscious mind and various psychological tools, which we'll begin to discuss, how you can get it to set its setting at a normal setting and trust itself that it can respond to an emergency situation in the future without always having to be extremely ready for it. Okay? Now, here's my concept. My concept is that each one of us operates at the highest level of trauma that we've ever experienced. Okay? For some people, that may not be very much. Okay? On a scale of, say, well, I've got 0, but who's going to experience no trauma? I mean, all of us have been probably smacked on the rear end when we came out, right? So that was trauma. All right, so anyway, but the highest level would be 10, of course. So maybe somebody might experience, their puppy died when they were little and they were very attached to it, and it was very difficult. Trauma. So that might be the highest. Might be the loss of a parent at an early age, or even a very close girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever. So in this scenario, the subconscious mind would operate at the highest level of trauma, but not go down on its own, at least. But might go up depending on if a higher level of trauma came about. Okay, so it would go up, but it wouldn't go down. Okay, unless, of course, you intervene, which is what we're going to be dealing with. How do I know? I mean, a lot of people are very skeptic about even the existence of a subconscious, much less the kinds of things that I have indicated that it does. Now, one of the stories that I have for you is occurred. Actually, it was interesting. I was, again, as I was saying, I was in charge of the group dynamics portion at the Behavioral Science Academy of Behavioral Science in San Antonio. We ran groups, and actually we taught behavioral science to all of the different branches of service: Marines, Air Force, Navy, and so forth, Army especially. One of my co-therapists, if you will, because in the group setting we would all be able to share equally to a certain degree. Anyway, so he actually began to verbalize that as a staff sergeant, he was beginning to have, which was, it was very brave of him to say this, believe it or not, that he was beginning to have hallucinations at night. As we often had to pull guard around buildings and different things in the middle of the night, and we also had to have escape and evasion training and so forth, even in the medical corps and so forth and so on. So he would have to be out at night, and he began to have hallucinations, and he wanted to sort of know what's going on, or wanted some help. And otherwise, he was a perfectly intelligent individual, a great teacher and lecturer and so forth. And anyway, he's actually a good friend of mine. As it turned out, as a young child, let's say 5 to 7, somewhere in there, his father was an extreme alcoholic, would come home in a rage, beat on this poor kid, and blame this poor kid for all his troubles. He would then throw him into the basement. It was an unfinished basement with junk piled everywhere. Keep the lights off. And he would tell him he'd have to be there all night. He would also tell him that there was a boogeyman down there that would get him. And so he'd better behave himself. So that you can imagine what a 5 or 6 or 7-year-old little boy spending all night with shadows, barely visible light, seeing, with their imagination running wild anyway. And now this father says, oh yeah, there's a boogeyman, and he lives down in our basement, and he's going to get you unless you behave. He socked that away in his subconscious mind. And in this particular case, it was cocooned so that it didn't really demonstrate itself in many other ways. But this began to break through to where now this trauma began to affect his behavior some 25, 30 years later. He didn't even remember this was happening. Actually, through a process of hypnosis, we were able to discover this. Because he didn't completely like I said, it had built subconscious had built such a cocoon or such a wall, internal wall, that he'd completely forgotten it. Selective amnesia. But that was breaking down now, for whatever reason. I began to demonstrate. No question in my mind, from the hundreds, if not thousands, of other examples through working with people in the various areas that I worked with them, that post-traumatic stress is created through the trauma into the subconscious mind. Now, what we want to do here, at least for a minute, is talk about how that the brainwashing aspect of it becomes a part of the actual physical trauma. He got beat, okay? He got thrown down the steps. He had to stay in the dark all night, so forth and so on. But the actual verbiage, the creation of that monster in this little boy's mind through words was actually what created this whole scenario to be a lot worse than what it was. If you just beaten the boy and thrown him downstairs, that's bad enough, trust me. But because of the monster that he created in this little kid's mind, those words The brainwashing in that aspect is what made him act in some of the ways that he's acted or whatever. We also want to just talk a little bit about just general brainwashing. For example, people who grow up with prejudiced parents, for example, they hear certain verbiage all the time, all their life. Stuff that just makes no sense, whatever. You hear that stuff. Now, the conscious mind, for the most part, hears stuff that it does not want to believe and tries to reject it. However, in fact, I'm reminded how many times people would say, well, I'm never going to be like my parents. And they end up being like their parents. All right? Why is that? Okay, well, the information comes, if it's said long enough and hard enough and sure enough, like person saying it with such authority and convincing about it, then it's going to go into the subconscious mind, and the subconscious mind is eventually going to accept it as truth. Okay, so we have to be aware of what we're listening to, who we're listening to, and so forth and so on, because oftentimes that brainwashing happens. I mean, brainwashing is going on right now in these churches, for example. If you've listened to any of my other videos, there are a lot of things being taught from the pulpits and on televisions and so forth and so on that in these churches that have nothing to do with the truth of the church that Jesus built. But they have been said so long and so convincing that everybody just, like sheep, follows the false teacher, and most of this stuff that they're teaching is so would fit somebody's need. I mean, so if you tell somebody that heaven is going to, somebody, a chocolate lover, says that your mansion is going to be made in heaven out of chocolate, then there you go. Be like, oh, okay, great. It's interesting how Adolf Hitler said that the most boldest, outlandish lies were the ones that he could push and would eventually be accepted. So if you only told a little lie, chances are most people wouldn't believe it, wouldn't deal with it, wouldn't be nothing. But you tell bold lies that absolutely have nothing to do with the truth, long enough, convincing enough, people will believe it. So there's a good chance that unless you're checking what information you have accepted, then you have also been brainwashed by either religious or political leaders, maybe your parents, whatever. It's up to us, our conscious mind, to decide what is right and what is wrong, and keep check over the subconscious mind. But for most people, this is not happening. Scriptures say that as a man thinks, so is he. And this is what we're finding out to be the truth right here. As a man thinks, that is who and what he is. But the thinking, most of the time, originates out of the subconscious mind. Let me tell you about the power of the mind. A story, actually, I've heard it a couple of times now, told in pulpits, about a man who was working in a railroad car environment, if you will, and he accidentally got caught, or got closed. They didn't know that he was inside a refrigeration car, railroad car, and he got locked in for a weekend. And one of the freezer units. And he began to realize when he got caught and locked in there by accident, he pounded, of course, and yelled and screamed and so forth, but everybody had taken off for the weekend. It's a long weekend. And nobody came to his rescue. They actually found him on Tuesday morning, frozen to death. But now the real deal is that they also discovered that the car was inoperational. The freezer unit was broken. It was actually about 60, 65 degrees inside the car. But because in this man's mind, he thought it was a working freezer unit, because of his mind, he froze to death. What we think, extremely important. We need to discover what the truth is. And so that's the reason why I've invited everyone to find out what is the truth about the church that Jesus built. And now I invite you to find out the truth about who you might be and why you might be who you are. And if you have post-traumatic stress, be able to take a look at how you might be able to begin to treat that. I will also say at this point, I'm going to do another video on Christianity versus medicine. And it's important to understand that God heals sometimes instantly and majestically and supernaturally just through the power of the Holy Spirit instantly. And sometimes he works through doctors and treatment people. But you have to be as wise as servants and as tame as doves when you get treatment from doctors and so forth. There's a lot of people out there that mean well, just don't know anything, have been programmed by the medical treatment folks and their philosophies and so forth. So you have to be careful, but we'll discuss it more. Anyway, so there can be treatment through the psychological aspects. It can be just because it's not, you know, people want to be healed instantaneously. A lot of people are. But a lot of times God is a God of process. And it's the work that we do on ourselves that's important just as much. At any rate, so what kinds of things can happen to the subconscious mind when there's a trauma? Any number of things, actually. There's a thing called catatonic state, where the subconscious might close down and not be able to handle anything. So there's even though there's stimulus coming in, that person is not responding to any stimulus. As a matter of fact, if you've seen The Awakening, it's you can move a person's arm and they'll stay that way. Anyway, so obviously that's an extreme. But psychosis, distortions of reality in the thought process or in emotions, depressions, suicide, homicidal, alcohol, drugs. A lot of people that are experiencing post-traumatic stress will try to treat themselves self-medicating through drugs and alcohol and end up with two problems rather than just the post-traumatic stress. Some people will eat their problems. It's another one. Sometimes it's subconsciously. For example, a lot of women who have been molested, subconsciously they will eat themselves to the point where the subconscious is convinced that nobody would want them and molest them again. So it's a self-protection kind of thing. Sex is another adrenaline. Adrenaline, sex, stimulant in the brain that gives relief. It also may be a part of the victimization issue that we'll talk about. So some people with this adrenaline seeking, they may have a death wish, so they may go jumping out of a perfectly good airplane, rock climbing without ropes, as I did. We'll talk about that later. They may become workaholics. Anyway, so a lot of their whole personality can change through a various different things, different ways, all because of a trauma. And the subconscious is trying to A, cope with that particular trauma, and B, find some sort of solution, hopefully, for it to prevent future such similar events of trauma. It's interesting. We we've heard that the devil that you know is better than the devil you don't know. Some person becomes a victim in a relationship, for example. I remember once um, in Germany, I was stationed there for about 10 years, working at the hospital there in Bad Cannstatt, which no longer exists as far as the Americans. But anyway, so I was living in a building, and there was an E7, Sergeant First Class, who was beating up his wife, banging around the walls and living below me. And so I called the military police and had him arrested. And so now, following up, they told me that he had, was taken to the stockade or the prison there. And anyway, so they ended up releasing him the next day, I guess. But he had orders not to go to his quarters, which is where he was the next day when I got ready to go to work. And so he's talking to her through the door. And so I tell him that he knows, that he outranked me, I think, at the time. But at any rate, so I told him, I said, you know, you're not supposed to be here, so you need to leave. So the wife on the inside now is banging on the door, telling me to leave him alone and blah, blah, blah. I saved her life from this man banging her and beating her up and bouncing her off the walls. And now she is attacking me because I'm telling this guy, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know. Victimization mentality. Once it gets locked in, the only thing that can change it is a healthy conscious mind that reprograms, or a process of reprogramming the subconscious mind. Okay, so let's discuss a little bit about the dynamics of victimization. All right, so there is any number of things that can cause us to become a victim. For example, if obviously as a child, as the young man I was telling you about earlier, one of the things that we do as children, typically we look up to our parents, we desire their approval, their love, their acceptance, and so forth and so on. And we're rejected by them because of the position that they're in, being our parent. How they treat us is obviously going to be a lot more impactful than Joe Blow off the street, who we don't even know. A wife or a husband, or a pastor, a priest, or a teacher, or whatever. So that's one of the things that Satan will use, is people that's closest to us, that we have the most emotional, psychological investment in. If they if they do something to help create a victim, then obviously that will destroy us more so than would somebody else. Sexual victimization, brother, stepfather, so forth and so on. I mean, it mostly happens with men being the perpetrators, but it occasionally happens with females as well. Certainly not going to say it doesn't, but anyway, so there are certain things that are going to create a greater sense of victimization. There's going to be a greater sense of trauma by the kinds of experiences as we indicated. Also, the amount of brainwashing that goes with that as well. Okay. Example, I know, I don't think she would want me to say who she is, but this poor child was taken away from her mother, who was young when she had her. I think she was 14, her mother was 14 at the time, so her father, who was a little older, ended up basically kidnapping this kid from her mother and giving her to her grandmother, who on the one hand claimed to be extremely religious and was religious, but was extremely authoritarian and abusive, verbally as well as physically, in that if this young child, female, didn't act correctly according to her standards, then she would have to stick her naked in a corner. Now, so anybody walk in the house. So there are a lot of things that will create us to be a victim that we are just not prepared to handle. And now the part of the continuation, or how Satan continues to keep us in that victimization circle, if you will, is what goes on in the mind. Guilt. He will create a sense of guilt, wrongdoing, because maybe the biggest thing, for example, is people who have been molested. There'll be that guilt, that dirtiness that you can't wash off because it's on the inside. And then that filthy feeling begins to say things like, well, you probably deserved it. You did something. So you deserve to be treated this way. You're a disgusting individual that your stepfather would be attracted to you, or a brother or cousin or whatever. And so that thought process that gets contaminated by this evil thing begins to create evil thoughts that get all glued to it, if you will, that particular experience, and it keeps that person a victim. Obviously, Satan doesn't want you to be reaching out to Jesus, to be asking for forgiveness and being made and washed in His blood, and then made whole and cleansed and so forth, and start having right thinking. So Satan works very hard at keeping those evil thoughts, keeping you down, keeping you, just barely above water, drowning in these awful, horrible feelings. And then, of course, if he can get you to drink or take drugs, become promiscuous on top of all of that, which is generally what happens, especially with females, is that then the whole victimization, you just create more victimization inside you. And so it's a cycle that's extremely hard to break. And obviously, if you're that permeated with that kind of victimization mentality and behaviors, then obviously you're creating other victims as you're going through life. You're leaving a wake of victims who will then also create other victims. Okay. All right, so now we're sort of almost at the 50-minute mark. I think I'm going to stop there for the first video, and then we'll pick up there with in the next one on the process of recovery. So I hope you'll tune in for that one as well. May God bless you. If you are suffering from post-traumatic stress, and so many people are, let's begin to pray for you. Let's begin to have maybe some dialogue to assist you in this process. But go through this whole video series and get everything you can get, what you can. But rely on the Lord and the voice of the Holy Spirit. Those who are led by the Holy Spirit are the sons of God. A lot of those voices that we hear on the inside are not of God. So if it is of God, it'll be righteous, it'll be true, according to the truth of the gospel. So anyway, so may God bless you in your recovery. So stay tuned for part number 2.